So now that we've covered several Six Sigma metrics, let's talk about how to calculate one of those, process lead time, in Microsoft Excel. So we'll calculate process lead time for what are called public works requests. Public works requests. And this is going to be real data you're looking at, not data that's been made up. But first you might ask though, what is a public works department? It's in the government. Okay, so they're going to oversee the maintenance of public property. That could include roads, parks, schools, and etc. They deal with a lot of service requests. Things like potholes on roads, graffitis on schools, downed trees, and so on. Okay, so public works departments oversee the maintenance of public property. And they've got to handle lots of service requests to fix and maintain that property. So for those requests, those public service requests, we want to ask this question. What is the process lead time? And remember, that's the time it takes the process to complete after a request is received. The time it takes to complete after that request is received. Now here's an example of what the data is going to look like. We're going to go into Microsoft Excel in just a minute, but you're going to see a request ID for that service request, a request category, kind of a high-level description of what's being done, the date the service request was created, and the date it was closed when it actually got finished. Then you'll see a status at the end that will tell you whether that service request is open, it got referred to someone else, or that it's been closed. Okay, so let's now go to Microsoft Excel and calculate process lead time. Now, if you want to follow along as I walk through this in Excel, feel free to go to the download section of this page and pull out the sample file. Now, if we want to calculate process lead time for these public works requests, we have everything that we need. We have the date created, when those requests were started, when they were opened, and the date those requests were closed. And so all we want to do now is insert a new column, and let's call this process lead time. Let's calculate the process lead time for each of these requests. Now to calculate that, all we're going to do is create a calculation and say take the date closed and subtract the date created. The date closed minus the date created. Now what it's going to do when you hit enter is it's going to show a date. What we want to do is change the format from a date to a number. We're not showing a date here, it's the number of days. And so go up to your formatting options, number formatting options, and then click on the number format. And that works. So it shows us for that first request that it took 5 days. That was the process lead time for that request. Now what I could do now is if I want to take this calculation and drag it all the way down, I can just double click the bottom right corner of this cell when I see that little plus icon there, then it'll run those calculations for me. But you'll notice an error though. On some of the calculations, you're going to see this error called value. Now in cases where there's no date closed, Excel doesn't know how to calculate the process lead time because the process is ongoing. And so we've got to do something to address that. In cases where there's no date closed, we don't want to do that process lead time calculation yet. Okay, so let's go back to our calculation for process lead time. And we need to add an if statement or an if error, something like that. And for this exercise, let's just add an if error in front of this calculation. So what it's going to do is if there's an error when this calculation is run, the value I'm going to ask it to provide is just blank, which is 2 quotations with no text in it. It's just going to leave it blank is what it's saying. And then I'll close my calculation. Now, right now that if error is only represented in this first calculation. Like before, what I want to do to drag that calculation down is double click the bottom right corner of the cell. And now I'll see that those 2 cases, at least in this view here, where there's no date closed, there's also no process lead time that was calculated. Now that I've calculated process lead time for individual requests, I want to have some summary level information too. So maybe it was the average process lead time by year, or maybe where are the most common requests coming from? What are the most common categories? So one great way to summarize your data and to kind of slice it up is to use what's called a pivot table. And now if you're totally unfamiliar with pivot tables, there's a video down below on this page that'll be an introduction to it. And they can be really powerful tools as you go through your process improvement projects and as you navigate and try to summarize data in Microsoft Excel. Okay, so I can go to my table here. I'm going to select anywhere in this table, just a cell in it. And then I'm going to go to the Insert tab and click on Insert Pivot Table. Now I'm going to keep all the default settings in place. It's going to open up a blank pivot table in a new worksheet, so I'll just click OK. Let me zoom in. And now the first thing that I want to do is if I want average process lead time by year, I'm going to take some date, and let's use the date the requests were created. I'm going to take the date created and move that down to the rows. And it's interesting, in this version of Excel, in my version, yours may be a little bit different, but it's going to group the dates by year. So we're going to say the creation dates. Okay, let's just put that for now, creation dates, so we know what we're looking at. And now if you didn't automatically see these dates grouped into years, you could right-click on one of the dates listed and click on Group, and you're going to see different options. You can group, hopefully, in your view, by years, quarters, months, days, and actually it's using an expandable option here, so I could actually drill down into quarters and months too in this case, but we'll leave this as is for now. I'm just going to collapse all of these fields so I just see the years. So I've got all of my dates listed here, and now what I want to know is the number of, or the average process lead time for each of these years. And are we getting better or are we getting worse? So I'm going to take the process lead time, the new column that I created, and drag it down to the values section of my pivot table navigator. And what it's doing right now is actually counting requests. I don't actually want it to count process lead time or count the number of requests. What I want it to do is to average process lead time. And so you can see up above it's saying count. That's not what I want. I want the average. So I'm going to right-click on one of these numbers for process lead time, and I'm going to say instead summarize values by the average process lead time. Okay, so what this is showing me now, and there's lots of decimals, but in 2016, the average process lead time was 28 days. In 2017, it was 29. In 2018, it was 29 as well. And actually in 2019, it dropped down to 15. We saw a significant decrease in lead time. And then in 2020, at least of the data that we have so far, it's dropped pretty significantly too. And so this is showing us the average process lead time by year. And it appears like they're getting shorter. And another way to look at this data is to actually insert a graph, because sometimes a graph is easier to understand or to digest than just a set of numbers. And so what I'm going to do is select somewhere in my pivot table and then go to the Insert tab and then click on the, it looks like the Insert Line or Area Chart on this version of Excel. And I like to use the line chart with markers. Okay, so this is going to pop up, and let me fit this into our space that we're working with. We were able to calculate the average process lead time by looking at the table, the data table, but it's even easier to digest by looking at this graph. We can see over the last 2 years there's been a significant drop in the average process lead time. Now what you can do after you put this together, if you want to make it presentable for a boss or for coworkers, is to use the formatting options in the Pivot Chart Tools section to make it look a little bit neater. We won't do that for now, but that would be an option. Now that I know the average process lead time, it might also be interesting to tell what the most common request category is, or the top categories. So I'm going to go back to my data table, and what I want to use is the request category column. I'm going to go back to my data table, select a cell somewhere, and then click Insert Pivot Table. And again, I'll stick with all the default values. And then in this new pivot table, what I'm going to do is take the request category and drag that down to the rows. And then I'm also going to take, because I'm looking for, like I'm not averaging process lead time, what I'm doing is just counting the number of requests. What I can do is also take that request category, the same column, and drag it down to the values. Because what it's going to do is count the number of categories, number of times that category occurs. And so the count is okay here. I'm not summing or averaging anything. I'm just counting the number of times these categories occur. Now what I may want to do is change the row labels text here to say category so that's clear. And then I might even change this count of request category to the number of requests. And at this point, what I want to do, because it's not sorted in any way, well, it's actually sorted alphabetically, I want to sort it by the number of highest requests first and then go down from there. So I'm going to click somewhere in this right-hand column. And what I'm going to do is say sort from largest to smallest. And now I've got my most common categories up at the top. So it looks like the most common requests are for illegal dumping, building maintenance, and electrical work. Now what I could do if I want even a little bit more detail about these most common categories is it looks like I can take this request description and in my rows drag it below the category, and I'll see within illegal dumping what the most common descriptions are. Now again, when I put in this new column, it's not sorted, and so what I'm going to do is click somewhere in these numbers, these description numbers. I'm going to right-click it and click Sort Largest to Smallest. And now that I can see within illegal dumping what the most common description was. So it looks like the illegal dumping of debris and appliances and litter in a public right-of-way were the most common issues in that category. Now if I go down, I could also see that the next piece, building maintenance, the next category, structural issues and electrical issues were the most common in that category. So pivot tables are a great way to really dive into your data, to slice it and dice it and to summarize it in different ways. Now it's great in this example to be able to figure out process lead time. Excel is a great tool for that.